Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. One of the key questions that Seneca is grappling with in On the Happy Life is the relationship between virtue and pleasure. And what we're going to see is that he provides a number of arguments and assessments of, let's call them proposals, for trying to bring pleasure and virtue together. Either to say they're going to be part of the happy life, the ultimate good for human beings, or that virtue leads to pleasure, or that you can easily combine them. And there's a lot that he's taking on here. One thing to point out, too, is that Seneca will distinguish between the Epicurean points of view, which he doesn't completely accept, and other hedonists, but we're going to talk about that elsewhere. So I'm not going to get too much into that. We're going to look at the arguments and rebuttals that he is going to provide here. So the first one that's really worth looking at is in chapter 7. And he says that these people, the hedonists, deny that pleasure can be separated, separare in Latin, from virtue, and they say that no one can live morally without living pleasantly, no one can live pleasurably without living morally also. So you can't have pleasure, but you also can't have what is intrinsically good, is often how it's translated, the honestum, honeste, the word that we get honest from, which in Latin is generally used for a translation of the Greek kalon, meaning beautiful, honorable, good in itself, all of those sorts of things. And typically, virtue ethicists would say, well, you've got the morally good and then you've got the pleasurable, and they can overlap to some degree, but they're not going to be the same thing at all. And Seneca is going to say, why is it, I ask you people, pleasure cannot be separated from virtue? As a matter of fact, we think that it can be separated from virtue. And by the way, this is something that goes all the way back to the time of Plato, if we're talking about explicit philosophy, because, Socrates will raise some of these very same problems. Aren't there some pleasures that are actually bad or dishonorable, right? He says, I suppose, given that all good things take their beginning from virtue's roots arise even those things you love and seek after. But if those things were indistinguishable, we would not see certain things that are pleasurable but not morally good. There are some pleasures or pleasurable things that we think are not morally good, and that's why we tell people, those are bad, right? And he goes on and he says that there's other things that are most definitely morally good, but arduous, attainable only through pain. So if pleasure is the good and pain is the bad, then it would be ridiculous to expect something good out of something bad. You're not going to have the good, honorable things from enduring pains, but we know that that's actually the case. So he goes on and he says, add the fact pleasure comes even to the most disgraceful life. Scumbags can have pleasure, whereas virtue doesn't admit of living badly, and certain individuals are unhappy, not without pleasure, but indeed precisely on account of pleasure. This could not have come about if pleasure had blended itself with virtue. Virtue is often without pleasure, but never in need of it. So virtue and pleasure, clearly not the same thing. He's going to go on, and this is also in chapter 7, and say, why are you trying to combine things that are dissimilar and Divergent. How are they dissimilar? How are they unlike each other? Well, virtue is sublime, elevated, regal, invincible, inexhaustible, right? So there's all sorts of key characteristics of virtue that pleasure not only lacks, but has the opposite of, according to Seneca. Pleasure is lowly, right? So it's not elevated. It's servile. It serves other things. Weak, transitory. It does duty in brothels and taverns. Indeed, it dwells there. And he's going to use a sort of geographical or city metaphor. You'll find virtue in a temple, in the forum, in the Senate house. Right? Pleasure you'll find hiding, keeping to the shadows around bathhouses and steam rooms and places that have reason to fear official inspectors. Soft and weak, dripping with wine and unguents, right? So salves and things like that. Pallid and rouged, embalmed with chemicals. Okay, so very clear contrast there. He also tells us that the highest good is something immortal. And what does he mean by that? It's not going to go away. If we actually do cultivate virtue, we have it within ourselves. And he says the highest good doesn't know how to depart, nor does it feel glutted or regretful. So you're not going to have too much of it. The highest good is actually in you if you possess it. What about pleasure? So pleasure goes away. Pleasure is extinguished, he says, precisely at the time when it delights. Might be a little bit of an overstatement there. Is that really the case, that as soon as you're enjoying the pleasure, it goes away? No, he's being a little bit hyperbolic there. But pleasure has a shelf life. You find something pleasant, it's not going to remain pleasant for you forever. So he says, nothing is ever stable whose nature consists in motion. There cannot be any substance to a thing that comes in and passes through so speedily and perishes precisely in its usage. And I think this is a really important point right here. It disappears because we consume what it is that gives us pleasure, and then it's consumed, and then we don't have pleasure. Whereas virtue, you're not going to run out of it. If you exercise virtue, you're not going to have more of it according to the Stoics, but you'll have the same amount. So that's a problem. Now he goes on, and he's going to look at some other arguments as well. This is in chapter 8. What about the fact, this is Seneca going on the attack, that there is just as much pleasure in bad things as good? Okay, that's an issue, right? Bonum et malum is the bad and the good there. So you can get pleasure out of bad things. You know, for example, having sex with somebody that you're not supposed to, right? Just as much as having sex within the relationship that you've chosen and are committed to. It's still sex, right? You can have just as much pleasure in, endlessly watching, streaming videos and not getting your work done as you can have in getting your work done, right? But then he goes on and he says, there's just as much pleasure for disgraceful people, the turpes, right? The people who are the opposite of honestes, the non-morally good, the opposite of that, the evil. So he says they take as much delight in their dishonorable deeds as morally good people take in their outstanding ones. Everyone gets pleasure out of their deeds, but the pleasure is not the index of whether the deed or the character is good or not. So that's a problem there too. Then he considers a question that the hedonists could raise. Aren't you just after virtue because that virtue is going to bring you pleasure? And we could think about the arguments that are made, for example, in Cicero's On the Ends, Book 1, for the 4 cardinal virtues. You need temperance so you don't drink too much, so you can actually enjoy the right amount of pleasure and keep on enjoying it. You need prudence so you can arrange your life so as not to be, bankrupt, for example. You need justice to stay out of trouble so that you won't be worried and disturbed by fears of getting caught. You even need courage to take on things that are painful so that you can have more pleasure later on. And Seneca knows these arguments well, and he says that's getting things mixed up. And we talked about this a little bit in a different place. Virtue is its own reward, is that catchphrase here. So we don't need to go deep into this. But he says, just because virtue is going to provide some pleasure doesn't mean that's the reason that it is sought. He's going to call pleasure an accessory, something that's extra, something that you get through being virtuous, but that's not why you're being virtuous. If you are virtuous just to get pleasure, you're not really virtuous at all, because if the pleasure goes away, so does the virtue, right? So he's going to say it's not approved because it gives pleasure, but if approved of, it gives pleasure as well. Then we get a discussion of the wise person, and this is quite interesting, right? So foolish people can have all sorts of pleasure. What about the wise person, this ideal that the Stoics, and not only the Stoics, but many other people in virtue ethics in antiquity talked about? So he says, when I say that I do nothing for the sake of pleasure, I'm talking about the wise person, the only one to whom you grant pleasure. I don't, however, call a person wise who has anything above him. So this is a very interesting point. For the Stoics, virtue is not something above us, it's something we cultivate within us. And to have virtue is indeed the happy life. Now, if you are seeking pleasure, the pleasure is something that you have within you, but you have to get it from other things, and you're placing those things metaphorically above you, giving them highest priority, so Seneca could say. So the wise person won't be doing that. Why not? He says if pleasure is distracting him, how is he going to stand up to toil and danger, to poverty and the other menaces that vex human life? How will he bear the sight of death? How will he bear the shattering of the world and enemies if he's been vanquished by such a soft opponent? Pleasure is a weak, soft opponent. If you can't handle standing up to pleasure and resisting its temptations, well, how are you going to actually follow through on the other things that go into wisdom? And then, a little bit later, he's going to talk about the wise person's pleasures. He says, what will they actually look like? They are deluded, remise, modest, modeste, practically powerless, languide. And he goes on and says that he gives two more qualifications: contained and scarcely noticeable. Why? Well, because wise people aren't seeking pleasures for their own sake. That's not where their focus is. He says they come unasked for. You're virtuous, you're going to have certain pleasures that will arise. They're not held in high regard or taken up with any joy by those who experience them. Indeed, wise persons blend the pleasures in and place them in their life at intervals, much as serious business is relieved by a game or a joke. So the wise person is going to have pleasures. They are not seeking pleasures at all. They just happen to come along and they enjoy them while they're there. So Seneca then is going to tell us, after talking about Epicurus, this is in chapter 14, let virtue go first, let these be the standards she bears. We will nonetheless have pleasure, but we will be its masters and its controllers. Pleasure will obtain something from us by asking for it. It will get nothing by coercion. So we have to rise above these pleasures. And then he says, if we look at other people's lives, those who yield to pleasure, first position of pleasure, are without both. What's the both there? Virtue and pleasure. By trying to have both of them or trying to have just the one, you actually lose both of these things that most people consider to be goods. And how do you do that? Well, he comes right out and says, lack of self-control, intemperancia. So temperancia or moderatio, those are words for the cardinal virtue we typically translate as temperance or self-control. And so intemperancia is the opposite of that, the lack of this. That one has to do with our ability to, manage our lives in terms of pleasures, right? That's one big function of temperance. And so what's going to happen, he says that the problem is that when someone seeks bad things instead of good, it's dangerous for him to attain them. Remember, we've identified that some pleasures are actually bad, right? So some pleasures could be good. The pleasure that you have in a friendship where you're sitting drinking some wine together, catching up on the business that you've been involved in, improving each other's characters. That could be quite pleasant, right? But there's also bad pleasures. Making your friend feel miserable, humiliating them. Ooh, I get a kick out of that, but my friend doesn't like it. That's a shameful, dirty, disgusting pleasure of sadism, right? So, the lack of self-control leads to people seeking bad things. And when you get a bad thing, it's not a good thing for you to get what is actually bad. He's got an interesting expression. He says, just as toil and danger attend our hunting of beasts, even when we've captured them, their possession gives us anxiety since they often gore their masters. So it is with great pleasures. They do great harms when they get away from us. And when we capture them, they capture us. The more numerous and greater they are, the more diminished is that person and the more things they're enslaved to. So living a hedonistic lifestyle is actually a bad strategy for even being happy, right? You're going to be pretty miserable if you indulge it too much. Finally, he asks a question on the part of the opponents. But what prevents pleasure and virtue from merging into one thing? And what prevents the highest good from being fashioned in such a way that one and the same thing is both morally good, honestum, and pleasurable, jucundum, right? So why can't we have it all? Why can't the highest good be both virtuous or morally good and pleasurable? Maybe there's other things that are pleasures, but we put those aside. Why not this unity of those? And so Seneca's answer here is kind of interesting. He says, no part of what is morally good will not be morally good. So you're not going to have like some sort of composite as the highest good. And he says the highest good will not have its own purity if it has something in itself that's different from what is better. And then he goes on and he says, if you try to make an alliance between virtue and pleasure, and an unequal one at that, through the fragility of the one good, he weakens whatever force in the other, and he throws his freedom under the yoke. It remains unbeaten only if it recognizes nothing else is more valuable than itself. And this leads to a key issue. He talks about it as needing fortune, needing what most people call the goods of fortune, right? Wealth, health of body, good looks, certain kinds of relationships, power or capacity to do things, social status, all of those sorts of things, which are not bad things in themselves, but fortune dispenses them more or less unequally and randomly. And if you're going to tie your happiness in with getting these things, then your happiness becomes very precarious, doesn't it? So, he's going to say if you do that, you are no longer free. This is the greatest servitude of all. He says the life that ensues is anxious, suspicious, fearful, afraid of events, hanging on the moments of passing time. You're not giving virtue a foundation that's serious and stable. You're ordering it to stand in an unstable spot. So again, you're not going to get the virtue that you're hoping for by trying to combine these things or say that they're the same thing. So Seneca is stressing over and over again, virtue, pleasure, two different things. It certainly can be pleasant to be virtuous, but that's not why you're virtuous. And trying to connect them together is going to be a losing strategy if your goal is to actually identify, pursue, and live the happy life.